Hello guys, this is International Master Alex Astaneh, and I'd like to welcome you to this video series on minor piece play. Well, regardless of which category you fall into, I really hope that you will find going through this topic to be both enjoyable and instructive. One final thing to say before we dive in is I'd like to give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering in this topic. So the material is going to be divided into 3 sections. I should say that all of the sections will be somewhat related. This is inevitable when we're discussing minor piece play, and in fact, when we're discussing positional play, everything is interrelated. So there will be some overlap, but the 3 broad categories that we'll be examining are A, good versus bad minor piece. So what we're going to be talking about is good knight versus bad bishop, good bishop versus bad knight, and also better bishop, either when each side has the same color bishop or of opposite colored bishops. We're going to be seeing examples of all of these mentioned categories. Then after this, we're going to focus on the second section, which is the advantage of the 2 bishops, how to use the so-called bishop pair. There is a reason why we don't talk about the knight pair, and that is because knights operate on light and dark squares, and so they're not restricted to one particular color complex. The bishops are, and therefore if you have both bishops, they operate in a synergistic fashion, and it's very, very important to know more or less what kind of an impact the bishop pair can actually have on certain positions. It can even be a decisive advantage. Finally, when we're done with the second section, we'll move on to the third and final category, which relates to just improving your minor pieces generally. So a couple of the topics examined there will be how to navigate a minor piece onto a better square, and also changing the pawn structure so that your minor pieces are favored. I mean, a lot of the time, let's take an example. If you have a light squared bishop and all of your pawns are on light squares, then the pawns are interfering with the mobility of your bishop, with the scope of your bishop. However, if you are able to change your pawns from light to dark squares, without actually moving your bishop, you can improve your bishop, right? So structure can impact the quality of pieces significantly, and that'll be a recurring theme throughout. So that's it as far as the overview goes. We're going to be examining a lot of games, not in full. Some games might be in full, but for the most part, it'll just be taken from a certain moment, and we will fish out the instructive concepts or maneuvers or ideas demonstrated. So with that said, let's now focus on our first game, which is going to demonstrate the power of a good knight versus a bad bishop, or at least a not so good bishop. So therefore, the battle of superior minor piece. And well, in this game, played in 1936 between Capablanca and Reshevsky, in this particular position here, we have a proximate equality, but Capablanca would have considered himself the superior player and therefore tried to imbalance the position. And so he played the move bishop takes d5 here. And well, this is an interesting decision by Capablanca. The idea is that, well, after black recaptures, presumably with the bishop, and we are going to be left with, rather than a situation of bishop and knight versus bishop and knight, we're now going to be left with a knight for white and a bishop for black. The structure is going to be probably symmetrical, assuming that black recaptures correctly with the bishop. So we're going to have these 4 pawns here for white and 2 on the queen side. And if you notice, it's going to be the exact same situation on the king side. But Capablanca hopes to somehow be able to demonstrate that this knight is superior to the bishop. Nevertheless, after this natural recapture, I think that it's hard to really believe that this knight is going to be superior to the bishop. This bishop, although it cuts across like this, and we see that the dark squared pawns on the king side would suggest that there are some light squared weaknesses, and therefore this might be a very strong piece. But it's important to note that this f pawn, it's not, let's say, on f4. That would be an entirely different story. But instead, because it's on f2, at some point he's going to be able to play f3 and blunt this bishop, maybe even e4. So we can speak of the bishop not being an especially effective piece, but at the same time, this knight, perhaps it can reach d3, but it should be okay. Some of its outposts from d3 are relatively well controlled, like e5 and c5. And if the knight does land on either b4 or f4, whatever damage it can do, for instance, before it can hit on a6, it should be something that black should keep under control. And objectively speaking, we should be talking about an equality here. However, Reshevsky really played into Capablanca's hands, and he played e takes d5. I mean, frankly, I simply don't understand this move, because the bishop is now left blunted by its own pawn. We now have a new pawn island for black, so that's a structural weakness, this isolated pawn. And in addition, well, this pawn that was on e6, if we just go back, after the recapture by the bishop, this pawn, though it's on a light square, it has the flexibility to move on to e5 should the need arise at some point. But once we play e takes d5, we notice that this bishop is blunted by the pawn, but the pawn is very immobile. It's being blockaded. And so we're not talking about a pawn being on the same color as a bishop, which is usually not a great thing because it blocks it, but we're actually talking in this particular case about an immobile pawn. And so this is especially problematic. Therefore, we can say that from this position on, white should be the one to press. He can use the worsened pawn structure and the superior minor piece, which in this case is definitely the knight, because we see that this bishop is completely out of the action for now. White now first played the move e3. It's an okay move. Perhaps it was better to drop the queen back and defend the pawn in this fashion so as to not commit it to a dark square, because in general you don't want to align your pawns like this, since long term the surrounding weaknesses, as you put your pawns all on dark squares, you create many weaknesses on the light squares, and those weaknesses may down the road be exploited by the black light squared bishop. Nevertheless, Capablanca's decision is understandable, since he does not want to move the queen for fear of a well-timed pawn push which would activate the bishop. And he also does not want to move the rook for fear of back rank problems with this knight pinned against the king. So therefore e3 is very reasonable. Queen e4, and now h4, a5, and f3. f3 is a very important move to dislodge the black queen from e4. Now, in this position, in my opinion, black should play the move queen to e5. And the idea is that in the event of queen takes queen, then after f takes e5, we see that the black pawn structure has largely corrected itself. And it's very important to have this pawn here on a dark square that may support a d4 push down the road, that may bring this bishop back to life. Not to mention the fact that this bishop can, in theory at some point, perhaps reroute via the h3 to c8 diagonal. This would have been more logical. There's another point as well about why white will not accommodate black by exchanging queens, and that is because now the d4 square is under black control, and we will soon see that that d4 square was a very, very important outpost for either the white king, which can travel to d4 at some point, or the white knight, which can also travel to d4, and from there it could target some of the black weaknesses. Therefore, I think queen e5 was the better choice, and white would almost certainly have played some moves such as king to f2, simply maintaining the tension. However, it's not clear how exactly white will force the queen exchange in the event of a sequence of moves such as king to f7 and now knight to d3. Well, all of a sudden rook c2 check is coming in, and of course this is a totally ridiculous line that white would never fall for, but the point is that after, say, something like king g1, now queen takes g3, and we notice that the white king needs to be a little bit careful. There are 7th rank invasions, and the queen in this particular position is eyeing up that potentially vulnerable g3 pawn. And we also know that if, let's say, white were to try and move that pawn, well, there may be checks such as on h2. So therefore, in my opinion, keeping the queens on the board, maintaining that tension would have been in black's favor. However, after f3, black captured the queen and after rook takes d4, we really see that although black may be able to hold the balance here, we really see that it's only white who is able to press. He has this knight which is temporarily on the back rank and therefore very inactive, but there's a big difference between temporary passivity and permanent passivity, and this knight is certainly only temporarily passive, as it's going to be stepping into either d3 or c2 in the next move or two. In this position, black played the move rook to c1, king f2, rook a1, seeking counterplay, but white does not have so many weaknesses. All of these advanced pawns are being very well protected by the white king, and of course the g3 pawn protects the h4 point, and really the only weakness is this a2 point. But after rook to d2, that is defended. Nevertheless, it should be noted that black's position is very much tenable here with good play, but here he makes his next mistake. So if the first big mistake was e takes d5, the second, in my opinion, minor mistake was exchanging the queens a little bit too readily. This is, for me, his second serious mistake after e takes d5, and that is the move pawn to a4. Why is this a mistake? Well, black needs not to place his pawns, his remaining pawns here, on the light squares. In this case, he had one pawn on a dark square and one pawn on a light square, and the best approach here would have been the move pawn to b4. Now he would be placing both pawns on the dark squares, and notice the immediate impact of the structural change on the effectiveness of his minor piece. All of a sudden, this diagonal has opened up, and at some point down the line, bishop to a6 may be threatened. For example, knight goes to d3, king f7, rook goes to c2 with the intention, the deadly threat of rook c7 check. Bishop now goes to a6, targeting the knight. And in the event of knight to c5, then after the move bishop to c8, the bishop, this is a very important relationship to be aware of between the bishop and a knight. When they're either on a rank or file, and there are two squares in between the minor pieces, the bishop in such an example will actually dominate the knight, because as you can see, none of the forward jumps of the knight are actually available to the knight, and therefore, although it's a little bit awkward because the bishop is undefended and it's being x-rayed by the white rook, it seems that more or less it's safe there, and in addition it has ready access once the knight moves to this important diagonal, and furthermore has access to the h3 diagonal as well as to the b1 to h7 diagonal. So with this move and this important placement of the black queenside pawns on dark squares, I think that black would have had a good game. Now, after the move a4, however, white is jumping in to knight d3, and we immediately highlight a major drawback of a5 to a4, which is the fact that this d3 knight can now enter into b4, and that's going to be a great square. The main reason, or at least the more obvious of the reasons, is that it's going to be immediately targeting this d5 point. The second point worth mentioning is that from there it will be defending the base of the white queenside pawn formation, so it's going to have an offensive and a defensive role. And the next thing, which is very important to note, is that this bishop scope will be limited. Once a knight lands on b4, notice how it will be covering the c6 and the a6 squares. And so we can imagine a situation where, let's say, for example, that black were to sort of make a little bit of a waste of time move, like king to f8, then knight goes to b4, and now king to g8. So he's basically just wasted a couple of tempi. Now after the move rook to c2, we immediately see that there's a very concrete threat to actually win the bishop, win the minor piece. And this is an important consequence to be aware of, that if you have a bad minor piece, one of the things that makes minor pieces bad is the lack of mobility. And of course, if your pieces are relatively immobile, it's more likely that they're going to be caught, that they're going to be, they already have a limited set of squares that they can go to, and all of a sudden they're chased, they're harassed on whatever square they're on, and well, they don't have as many places to run as a good piece with vast scope. It's very, very difficult to trap a long-range piece such as a bishop if it's a good piece with a great scope and also perhaps with good stability as well, which is another marker of a good piece. Notice, for instance, how this knight on b4 is much, much more stable because although it doesn't have an outpost, it does have access to an outpost at some point, a stable outpost. And even though right now it's not on one such outpost, it also is not easy to harass because black has no dark squared bishop, has no pawns that can harass the knight, and also has not much access to ranks or files to, for this rook to somehow pressure the knight. Yeah, so therefore we can see the danger there just once knight b4 becomes an option. Black played rook to b1, which is logical, now targeting the b3 point, and white played rook b2. After rook takes b2, black did not have so much of a choice in exchanging because otherwise if he moves the rook away, then b takes a4 would be targeting this bishop, right? So a move such as rook to h2, after b takes a4, we notice black cannot capture back because the bishop is falling. And in the event of, say, rook h2 check, king moves, and rook takes b2, knight takes b2, then very conveniently for white, the knight on b2 will be defending the pawn. So after rook b2, rook takes b2, knight takes b2, black has succeeded in exchanging rooks. I mean, it gets him a little bit closer to draw in certain regards, but on the other hand, this particular position still requires extremely accurate play from black, and plenty of suffering here. I mean, it's objectively speaking, I think it's very difficult for white to win this if black plays perfectly, but in practice, it's very, very difficult to play this kind of endgame accurately. Black actually starts off already wrong with this move bishop to c6. Instead, the line beginning with a takes b3 would have been a little bit better, proceeding with a systematic liquidation of pawns. We'll see what I mean by this. A takes b3, a takes b3, and now g5. One of the benefits structurally here that black has is that he has what we call in endgames the potential to create an outside passed pawn. And that's very, very important because, most of the time if you're talking about openings or middle games, we're talking about the power of central pawns, centralized pawns. But in endgames, there are certain different rules. The logic can often change, and outside passed pawns can be considered stronger than central pawns because activity and centralization of the king is such an important factor. But if you have an outside passed pawn and you run it up the board, very often it can force one of the kings to sort of go after that pawn, decentralizing the king, and then in the meantime, the other king is able to sort of roam freely and maybe do a lot of damage on the other areas of the board. So this is one of the reasons why outside passed pawns are very strong. And here black should begin with g5. The point being that in the event of h takes g5, f takes g5, white will have to be very careful that black does not create a passed pawn. Therefore, after g5, let's say knight to d3, king now goes to f7, knight to b4, king goes to g6, again with some idea of perhaps capturing, and then king h5, having created a weakness here. So h takes g5, f takes g5, and g4 is logical. At least this way, white has prevented any sort of creation of an outside passed pawn. But the problem is after h5, g takes h5, king takes h5, the material has been reduced, which is one of the points that we were making, and it may be reduced further if black can force the exchange of these two pawns. And it seems that with correct play, also notice the black king has become a lot more active. So if the white king decides to maneuver up to that beautiful d4 square, the black king may try and create problems for white with this pawn on f3, which is on a light square, and we know that makes it already, an easy target for that black light squared bishop. Therefore, I think that this is probably something very close to equal. However, after knight takes b2, black instead played the move bishop to c6. Now, this move does not really improve the bishop's placement, and given the fact that white's plan, as we've already shown, is to reroute that knight back to b4, then the bishop is going to be on pre once that occurs, costing black some time. Knight goes to d3, and now black played the move pawn to g5. It's the right idea, but with the wrong timing. Now black's bishop is misplaced relative to the previous line, and we can certainly say that white's knight is more active relative to having executed this plan a little bit earlier. H takes g5, f takes g5, and knight b4. No surprises there. A takes b3, a takes b3. And bishop to b7, and now g4. So we see a very, very similar type of position that we were examining, but, well, in earlier examples, that black king had reached g6 and preparing the move h5, whereas in this case, black sort of burned a couple of tempi here, just moving the bishop back and forth, and that is giving him some problems here. King goes to g7 and king e2. Although white is extremely comfortable here, nevertheless, it remains uncertain whether he would be able to break through if from this point forward, black showed accurate defense. After all, white still has to concern himself with this f3 pawn. For example, a well-timed d5, d4 shot would activate the bishop. And also he has to concern himself with the aforementioned idea of pushing the h-pawn forward. So it's not so easy. However, here, black goes wrong. The plan that black should counter is the white king's entry to d4. Now, in this particular case, earlier on, he could have gone king to g6, h5, and remember what we showed. We showed how the active black king could arrive onto g3 very quickly and so prevent this plan. But here, because he lost a couple of tempi, we really cannot do this, and so instead black should have played king to f6, only move, king now goes to d3, and king to e5. And the point is that here, the white king struggles to make further progress. Knight to c2, bishop c6, knight d4. In the absence of the white king being able to use that square, the knight will use this square, defending on f3, and perhaps king c3, king to b4 is now the idea. The problem is that after accurate play by black, bishop e8, king c3, and now h5, in this case not with the support of the king, which was busy preventing king to d4, the pawn advance is executed. G takes h5 is necessary, otherwise this pawn is just going to promote. G takes h5, bishop takes h5. Notice one saving grace for black, actually, is that although his bishop is the inferior minor piece on the basis of the pawn structure, having many pawns on the light squares, and also in part to do with the fact that that knight is so stable, there is one saving grace for black, and that is that there were pawns from the beginning position, and even still here, on all sides of the board. And in general, when you have pawns on the queen side, on the king side, on the center, everywhere on the board, this is going to benefit the black bishop, especially if you have pawns on the queen and on the king side. Why is this? Well, it's because the bishop is a long-range piece, and the knight is a more short-range piece. And so we see how the bishop is able to sort of maneuver very, very quickly from the queen side onto the king side and create problems. And we also note that a couple of white pawns are on light squares, which makes them ready targets. So he's able to use this in order to more or less hold the balance with accurate play. King goes to b4, g4. F takes g4 is necessary because in the event of f4, then after a move such as king to e4, this pawn is just unstoppable. So therefore, f takes g4, bishop takes g4, and now king takes b5. But the problem is, although black's weakness has fallen, black has actually liquidated a lot of white's pawns, and after king to e4, this pawn on e3 is not possible to be defended. For example, in the event of knight c2, then bishop to d1, and we notice that the entire white position is actually falling apart. Here, of course, white is not going to be losing this after some move like knight b4, bishop takes b3, knight takes d5, and we simply have a draw, right? because whether or not white takes the bishop on the next move, of course, we know that this is a theoretical draw. And so, yes, so with this kind of accurate play, black would have been able to hold the balance. King f6, and exploiting the fact that, yes, there are many pawns that are on light squares for white. I can target those with the bishop. And also, there are pawns scattered across the board. And notice how I am able to do maneuvers such as bishop c8, d7, e8, and from there start influencing the king side. So therefore, having used correctly the trumps in his position, black would have been able to hold the draw, I suspect, but he did not do so. He played king g6 instead, and after king d3 tried this plan but with the wrong timing, h5, g takes, and king d4. And in this variation of black, which is not just a variation, but it's actually the game continuation, the black weakness is immediately falling without a sufficient reduction of material on the board. Therefore, with the accurate technique, the position is just very easy to win for white. In fact, somewhat unusually in the game, Capablanca actually went wrong, giving Reshevsky a chance to achieve an equal endgame a few moves later. Reshevsky missed this chance and ended up losing the game. Nevertheless, we're not so much interested in the precision of the play in the final few moves. The game lasted another 12 or 13 moves. I will show you the moves. King h4, now knight takes d5, king g3, and here white played the move pawn to f4. Black responded with pawn to g4, then f5, bishop c8, king e5, bishop d7, e4, bishop e8, king to d4, and this was in fact the mistake by Capablanca, retreating with the king. Instead, the simple move pawn to f6 would just have won. But after king to d4, there were some options for black to get back into the game with precise play. After king f3, e5, g3, knight went to e3 to stop the g-pawn, and here, in the event of bishop to h5, it's unclear how white will actually proceed, because if e6, bishop g4, e7, bishop h5, f6, king f4, and somehow that bishop, that light squared bishop, combining with that advanced g-pawn for black, is really making it very problematic for white to somehow make progress here. So it appears that there was an opportunity for a draw, but Reshevsky missed his chance, played king f4, and then after e6, g2, knight takes g2, king takes f5, king d5, that extra pawn will decide it, king goes to g4, knight e3 check, king f4, king d4, and here black resigned. So this concludes our first game, and probably the game that we will be examining in most detail. So I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you found it instructive. I think some very interesting elements of minor piece play were on display in this particular game. The good knight versus bad bishop, the impact of the structure, the light squared pawns being easy targets for the black bishop in the case of white's light squared pawns, and the light squared pawns for black being actually a problem as well, because it impacted the mobility of the bishop. I think it's quite a common mistake at club level that players believe that if they have a light squared bishop, well, they better put their pawns on light squares so that they can protect them. But although there are many exceptions, actually as a general rule, you really want to put your pawns on dark squares for the reasons mentioned before, such as, for example, improving the scope of your pieces, and also having the pawns cover squares that your bishop cannot cover, and therefore having a little bit better control of the board overall. So anyway, with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed this game, and I shall see you in the next one.